So I realised I had to narrow it down quite a little bit, because otherwise we might be here all day, which I'm sure you've got other things to be doing. So I thought it might be quite interesting to focus on some of the preconceptions people often have about Australia, and just to kind of pick away at those and see to what extent they're true or false, sort of illuminate some realities, I suppose, and look at some myths people have. So let me just start my so we're the generic body for Australian wine. Our head office is based in Adelaide in Australia, but I obviously work over here in the our office is in London, and we cover theoretically the entirety of the MEA, but realistically all my work is done in the UK and Northern Europe, and really just going out and talking to people, talking to trade about Australian wine, and trying, you know, to educate people a bit and give people some talking points when they're going out and selling Australian wine. So that's my role. So I am basically just going out there and talking to people about Australia all the time. And I think some of the preconceived ideas people tend to have about Australia that kind of crop up time and time again can kind of come down to 3 or 4 main ones. The first one being Australia's big. Then, you know, Australia's hot. I think particularly for people who haven't been to Australia, if you're thinking about Australia in your head, you're probably thinking images of the red desert, the bush, perhaps tropical beaches. So all these kind of hot climate images. And then in terms of winemaking, I think there's obviously an idea people have about Australia being quite modern, high-tech winemaking, perhaps looking at things like bulk wine, huge vineyards. So that's kind of where I thought we'd look at throughout this next half an hour, and sort of unpick those few things and see to what extent they're true or false, and look at some realities along the way. So kicking off, first of all, if this is going to work. There we go. So is Australia big? Well, yes, quite clearly Australia is huge. And I think here actually quite often, yes, people think it's big, but they don't realise quite how big it is unless you've been there, because as you can see from this slide, it really is the size of a continent. It is bigger than Europe. So I think unless you've been there and sort of flown across the country, it's really hard to visualise just how big it is. So putting just a little bit of scale on this map, if you fly from Perth in Western Australia across to Sydney, that's about a 2,000-mile journey. It's about a 5-hour flight, and you're crossing 3 time zones. So it's a similar kind of journey to traveling from London down to Cairo. So really quite a long flight. It is a massive country. So it's certainly always worth keeping in the back of your mind when you're talking about Australia, just how big it is. Because I think there can be a tendency for people to talk rather sweepingly about Australia. So talking about the Australian vintage, or talking about Australian Shiraz always tasting like X, Y, or Z. But if you then come back to remembering just how big Australia is, you know, you wouldn't really talk about the European vintage or saying all European wines taste the same. So that's definitely something that's always worth remembering about Australia. Another way to look at it, if you want another little snippet, Australia is actually bigger than the moon, would you believe? So the moon's diameter is about 3,400 kilometres. And Australia at its widest point from east to west is about 4,000 kilometres. So it really is a vast, vast country. So unsurprisingly, therefore, it is very diverse, both in terms of topography, in altitude, in climate, huge variety across the country. So no surprises then that, you know, wine from different parts of Australia all does taste very different. Moving on to the wine regions themselves, there's 65 wine regions in Australia, and don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on this. There's probably only about 20 of them that we regularly see in export markets. A lot of them are pretty small, that tend to be only drunk domestically. There's about 20 of them that you tend to see over here in the UK and in other export markets. And as you can see, they're predominantly around the southern part of Australia. So you might be thinking, okay, it's a big country, 65 wine regions, that sounds like quite a lot, so it must produce a lot of wine. Well, the figures here is it's about 146,000 hectares of vineyard in Australia. Now, again, that might sound like a lot, but actually that's only about 4% of global plantings. Or to put it another way, it's about the same as Bordeaux and Burgundy put together. So if you remember back to how big Australia is versus the size of France, let alone the size of Bordeaux and Burgundy, it really doesn't produce that much wine in relation. But what it is a huge exporter. So only about 1/3 of the wine Australia produces is drunk domestically in Australia. About 2/3 is exported. And here in the UK, we're the #1 export market by volume. And the UK and the, Australia and the UK off trade is the #1 category and has been for the past 15 years. So we see a huge amount of Australian wine here in the UK, and I think that's why there can be this perception that Australia produces a vast amount of wine. It does produce quite a bit, 4% of global plantings is not nothing, but it's certainly not anything in comparison, particularly to, the big producers of France, Italy and Spain. So I touched on very briefly when we were just talking about how big Australia is to the varied climates. And it really shouldn't be a huge surprise when you consider how big Australia is that, climates in Australia are very varied. And I think there is this perception that Australia is hot. And it's true, it is a hot country. If you flipped Australia into the Northern Hemisphere, it would occupy the same latitude as essentially the entire northern part of Africa, the Mediterranean Ocean, and the very southern Mediterranean part of Europe. So it is relatively close to the equator. So what that means is wherever you are in Australia, you always have this very brilliant sunlight, very high sunlight intensity. But that doesn't mean that the entirety of the country is hot, because there are these cooling influences. One of them in particular being the Great Southern Ocean. So if you can remember from the map I showed you a minute ago about where all the Australian wine regions are, they're predominantly around the southern part of Australia. And that's really because, yes, it is relatively further south, obviously, so away from the equator, but because of this Southern Ocean that has such a moderating effect on the climate. So the Southern Ocean is a very cold ocean. All the waters comes up from Antarctica, so it really acts to moderate the climate in all of these coastal regions. And I hope you can just about see this quote that I've put on this slide from Brian Crozer, because I think it illustrates this really nicely. So he says, the Great Southern Ocean creates the same range of climates at, and this is where I can't quite see this quote, move this, at 33 to 40 degrees south, as is found in the Northern Hemisphere between 40 to 47 degrees north. So really what that means is the climate at these latitudes is much cooler than you would otherwise expect, and that's simply down to the effect of this cool Southern Ocean. Sorry, I'm just playing around, there we go. And then the other thing that's worth always mentioning in terms of cooling influence is altitude. Because I'm sure you're all aware, the general rule of thumb here is that for every 100 meters you go up in altitude, temperatures decrease by about 0.65 degrees C. So obviously the higher you go, the cooler it is. And actually Australia's wine regions, many of them are much higher than a lot of European wine regions. So you do have this cooling influence from altitude. Now it says on here the highest Australian wine regions are up to about 1,000 to 1,200 meters. Actually, I did just check, and the highest vineyard at the minute in Australia is up in the New England GI, which is in New South Wales, and that's at 1,320 meters. So real significant altitude up there. So really cooling the climate because of that altitude. So when you're talking about altitude in Australia, there's three major, I suppose, geographical areas of elevation that's worth mentioning. So over in Western Australia, you've got the Darling Scarp. Now this isn't particularly high, it's only up to about 400 meters in terms of altitude, but it does add enough influence of altitude to cool, particularly the inland parts of Great Southern. So places like Franklin River, Parongarup and Mount Barker, all up about kind of 300 meters in altitude because they're on the Darling Scarp. So that is adding some cooling influences over there. More importantly, across in South Australia, you've got this Mount Lofty ranges. So these start in the foothills of McLaren Vale, run up through the Adelaide Hills, up through the Eden Valley, and then into the Clare Valley. So it's all the same geological area of elevation. And that's really important in terms of moderating the climate in those regions. So the highest parts of the Mount Lofty Ranges are in the Adelaide Hills, just outside Adelaide, getting up to about 700 metres, and the highest vineyards are kind of at 500 or 600 metres. So really cool, those vineyard sites, and that's where you get sparkling wines made, lots of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc in the Adelaide Hills because of this elevation, cooling the climate there. And again, that's why the Eden Valley is so different to Barossa Valley, even though they're right next to each other, they're contiguous regions, but the Eden Valley is much higher. So Barossa Valley kind of sitting at about 200, 250 metres. Eden Valley is going up to about 550 metres, so much, much higher. So you're getting coolness because of the elevation, also extra breezes. It's much windier up in the Eden Valley. So this is why you get the difference in styles between Eden Valley and the Barossa Valley. But then, as you can see from this map, the major area of elevation is this Great Dividing Range. That runs right down the eastern coast of Australia, right up in Queensland and right the way down through into Victoria. And it adds elevation, particularly to vineyard regions in New South Wales and in Victoria, cooling the climates in a lot of these regions. And it's also got a very important aspect in terms of, in the summer, there can be tropical weather systems that sort of barrel down the eastern coast of Australia. Basically, they hit into the Great Dividing Range and they dump all that rain. So unsurprisingly, most of the wine regions are either on the top or the western side of the Great Dividing Range, so in the rain shadow, so they're not affected by those vintage rains. And then off the bottom here, you've got Tasmania. Now I said earlier that latitude is not cooling anything in Australia because it is relatively close to the equator. Tasmania is the one exception to this because that sits at a latitude sort of similar to Northern Rhone. So it is, you know, a little bit cooler because of latitude than the rest of Australia, but also pretty cool because you've got obviously totally surrounded by that cold Southern Ocean. Now, just to illustrate what I've just been talking about, I just popped this map on here. So this is minimum temperatures with a 30-year average. And I think it's really interesting because you can really pick out where those areas of elevation are, and particularly if you're looking at that Great Dividing Range down that eastern coast, and much, much cooler, obviously up at the higher altitudes. And you can also see where the Mount Lofty Ranges run down in South Australia. Now, just to illustrate what I've just been talking about, that yes, Australia is a hot country and there really are warm inland regions, very much so, in terms of winemaking, but you've obviously also got this influence, coastal influence and influence of altitude cooling climates. So you do have a huge diversity in terms of wine regions. So I've just got 4 quick slides to flip through just to show you this, to see the differences between the wine regions. So RUTHERGLEN is in Victoria, right inland in Victoria, so very continental climate, absolutely no influence from the ocean. And as you can see, it's only sitting at 170 metres altitude, so very little influence from altitude as well. So it's a hot region, which shouldn't be a surprise if you think about what sort of wine styles are made in RUTHERGLEN, because it's particularly famous for its fortified wines, you know, the RUTHERGLEN muscats and Taupe when they need very, very ripe grapes in order to make those styles. So you've got the mean January temperature there at 23.7 degrees C, so hot region. Then compare that to the Barossa Valley, so in South Australia again here, more of a Mediterranean climate. There is a little bit of ocean influence here. You do get some of those breezes coming through, but still warm, you know, 21.4 degrees C, that mean January temperature. A little bit of altitude, but not a huge amount. And then heading down to the Yarra Valley. So this is about an hour's east of Melbourne, down in Victoria. So here, there is a bit of altitude in parts of the Yarra Valley, the Upper Yarra Valley getting up to about 350 metres. Mostly continental, but again, some maritime influence from that cool Southern Ocean. And you can see here the mean January temperature, much cooler, 18.7 degrees. Unsurprising, you know, Yarra Valley is particularly well known for its Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And then compare that to Tasmania. So as I said, Tasmania is the one part of Australia which has some cooling influence from the latitude and then obviously totally surrounded by that cold Southern Ocean. So it very much is the coldest region in Australia. Temperate climate, very strong maritime influence. And you can see that mean January temperature being so much lower there, 16.8 degrees C. So very cool and particularly well known for sparkling wines. So absolutely incredible sparkling wines coming out of Tasmania. So I think then very quickly, we've just talked about, yes, Australia is big and probably a lot bigger than perhaps a lot of people perceive. And yes, Australia is hot, but it does have this quite diversity despite that, and because of various influences, including that Southern Ocean and the influence of altitude. So unsurprisingly, therefore, there's a huge diversity in terms of wine styles that are produced in Australia, depending on the region and depending on its topography, and all the other aspects as to what is planted there. So I suppose the next preconception people often have about Australia is that it's modern. Well, yes, quite clearly it is a New World country. The first varieties, the first vines didn't go out until 1788 with the first fleet. And it wasn't really until the early 1800s that things began to kick off in terms of viticulture. Actually, it was a handful of predominantly Scottish people who really kick-started viticulture in Australia, the MacArthur family being one of them, but particularly famously a guy called James Busby. So James Busby was a Scottish horticulturalist. He moved out to Australia in, I think, 1824. And then in 1831, he actually came back to Europe and spent 6 months traveling the vineyards of France and Spain. I mean, tough job, hey? And he was collecting cuttings of vine varieties wherever he went. And he ended up with 650 different cuttings. Each of them were packaged up individually and then shipped back to Australia with him. Now, 362 of those survived the voyage back to Australia, and those were then divided into two. Half were planted in what is now Sydney's Botanical Gardens. For any of you who've ever been to Sydney, you'll know exactly where I mean. And the other half, James planted at his property called Kirkton Park up in the Hunter Valley. And from there, other people were bringing in cuttings too. Those vines were propagated, further cuttings were taken and then planted in other parts of Australia. And it wasn't long really before commercial viticulture was happening across Australia. By the mid-1800s, there was commercial viticulture in every state. And actually the first export of Australian wine to the UK was in 1854. So we've been drinking Australian wine over here for a very long time. We have quite a long relationship with Australian wine. So yes, it very much is modern, but that's not really the whole part of the story, because I think something perhaps a lot of people don't really realise about Australia is it's actually home to the oldest vines of a number of different varieties in the world. So the oldest Shiraz is in the Barossa Valley, planted in 1843. That now goes into Langwell's Freedom Shiraz. That's imported by Berkman over here. The oldest Grenache is planted at Cirillo Estate. It was planted in 1850. That's imported by G&B Shippers. The oldest Mourvèdre in the world, that was planted in 1853, now goes into Hewitson's Old Garden Mourvèdre, imported by FMV. And the oldest Cabernet Sauvignon in the world was planted in 1888, also in Barossa, and that is Penfold's Block 42 Columna Cabernet Sauvignon. So really incredible heritage of old vines. Well, that was all in the Barossa, but actually it's beyond that as well, because actually the oldest Dolcetto in the world is planted at best in Grampians down in Victoria, and that was planted in 1865. So quite an incredible history of old vines in Australia, which might be a surprise until you remember about phylloxera. So as I'm sure you're all aware, phylloxera decimated the vineyards in Europe back in the 1860s onwards, and eventually all those vineyards had to be uprooted and then replanted on grafted rootstock that was resistant to phylloxera. Yes, I know there are some small segments in Europe where there was no phylloxera and there are still some old vines remaining, but the vast majority of European vineyards had to undergo this uprooting and replanting. Now, phylloxera did go to Australia in 1877 into part of Victoria, but it never really spread beyond that. So there's a bit of phylloxera in parts of Victoria and also in parts of New South Wales, but the entirety of South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania are all phylloxera free to this day. So this is why all these old vineyards have remained, because there's never been any need to grub them up and replant, and many vineyards are still planted on their own roots like this. So important are these old vines, particularly in the Barossa, that they actually have this old vine charter. This was started in 2009 as really as a way for them, both internally and also externally to consumers, to really talk about these old vines and celebrate them. So the charter is, as you can see, it's quite simple. So they classify old vines as anything older than 35 years old, and then survivor vines anything older than 70 years, centenarian vines anything older than 100 years, and ancestor vines anything older than 125 years in age. And you do begin to see these on bottles over here now, which is great to see. So to put some figures on here, in the Barossa there's just over 11,000 hectares of vineyard, predominantly in the Barossa Valley, a little bit in the Eden Valley. Of that, 2,500 hectares are classed as old vines, so more than 35 years old. So that's over 20% of the region. And actually there's just over 200 hectares more than 100 years old. That's about 2% of the region. So quite incredible that they still have this huge amount of old vine vineyards in the Barossa. And really something I think they should celebrate even more than they are down now, because it's something that's very, very special. And then I suppose the other part of, yes, Australia being modern, yes, it is in terms of viticulture, but geologically speaking, if you consider it that way, Australia is actually the old world and Europe is the new world. And I say that quite simply because the oldest rocks on the planet are found in Australia, and they've been dated to 4.4 billion years old. So that's only 200 million years younger than the planet itself, which I find quite mind-boggling. Now, those particular rocks aren't in any wine regions, but even if you look in wine regions, you're looking at a scale totally different to what we see over here in Europe. So, for example, in the McLaren Vale, they've done quite a lot of research into their geologies and soil types in the region. They found they've got 40 different geologies within the region, and the oldest one is 550 million years old. Now, if you compare that to, say, the Paris Basin, which is the geological area of northern France, that covers the Loire, Champagne, Burgundy, that dates to about 2.5 million years old. So a total order of difference to what you're seeing then in McLaren Vale at 550 million years old. So I think quite fascinating, and something, again, I think a lot of people don't necessarily realise about Australia, that it is home to these incredible old geologies. What that means also, though, is it's incredibly diverse in terms of soil type, because Australia's been on its own for so long, for over 100 million years on its own. It's been very, very eroded. If you think about that Great Dividing Range I talked about, so the oldest peak there is just over 2,000 meters, so not super high, but in geological history that would have been taller than the Himalayas. But because Australia's been on its own for so long, it's been so eroded, all those peaks have weathered down quite a lot. So there's a huge amount of diversity in soil types in regions. So again, just talking about McLaren Vale, there's actually 19 different soil types within the region, everything from sand to clay to loam. So it's not so simple as when you're talking about European wine regions, when you might be able to talk about one or two soil types. It's a much, much more complex than that. And then just touching briefly, because I know we're getting on with time, about bulk wine. Because I think, again, it's something, bulk wine and branded wine is obviously something people think a lot about Australia. And yet the reality is here, yes, I mean, particularly in the UK, 80% of what we import into the UK from Australia is imported in bulk. You know, by obviously the brands and supermarket owned brands and all that sort of thing. But I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. On the one hand, you've got actually importing in bulk is much more environmentally friendly than importing in bottle, much more sustainable. And actually it's got benefits as well in terms of quality for the wine, because when you're bulk shipping in bulk, you're shipping in a big flexi tank. So it's got a very low thermal inertia. And if you think, when you're shipping across the equator, you're obviously going across hot places, might be sitting on the dock on a port for a while. And so it takes a long time for a big body of liquid to heat up and change temperature, versus a small bottle. Actually, the temperature in the bottle can change quite significantly. So it can be much better for wine to be shipped in flexi than actually in bottle. But that's just one part of Australian wine. You know, obviously, because we're such a huge market for volume Australian wine here in the UK, we do see all those big brands. You know, we see a lot of the, should we say, the lower priced end of Australian wine. But that is really not the whole picture. It's actually a very small part of the picture, because there's over 2,400 wineries across Australia, and 75% of those produce less than 100 tonnes. So there's a huge number of small winemakers, small wineries doing really exciting things. And these are often the guys who are working sustainably, biodynamically, organically, and often working perhaps with alternative varieties. I think at the beginning I said, when people think about Australia or talk to me about Australia, you know, Shiraz and Chardonnay are the varieties they talk to me about. Unsurprising, you know, Shiraz accounts for about 25% of all plantings in Australia. But again, the reality is there's actually over 130 different varieties planted. And I think recently there's been a real increase in interest in some of these alternative varieties, particularly southern Mediterranean ones, things like Touriga Nacional, Mira d'Avola, Fiano. All of these things are being planted now, and people are very excited about them, but tends to be from the smaller winemakers. But I think this is where Australia actually has a bit of a benefit, if you like, perhaps for the on-trade in particular and the independent off-trade, because all of these brands are going to be going into, you know, the supermarkets, and, you know, that's one segment of the market. But beyond that, you know, Australia has a huge amount of exciting wines from all across the country. You know, I've talked about that diversity in terms of climate and style, and there's a lot of opportunity for people to try and sell some of these more exciting varieties, you know, different styles of winemaking. And I think for a lot of consumers, there's a real trust in Australia and brand Australia, whether they've been there on holiday or, you know, for a lot of people, it's where they started off drinking wine. So they kind of keep this trust in Australia. And so when you can go and say, oh, I've got this Australian wine, but it's made from a, you know, cool grape variety or this tiny production doing something different, they can actually be really easy sells, even though they're a hand sell, they're not a hard sell. So I think there is a lot of opportunity there. So just before we move on to questions, I just wanted to flag up our education resource in case any of you aren't aware of it. So we launched this about 18 months ago now. It's on this, it's Australian Wine Discovered is what we've called it. It's all on this website, australianwinediscovered.com. And it's basically entirely free, it's open access, free to download, and it's available to anyone to use. So it consists of 25 modules. They're covering the major Australian wine regions, varieties, and then broader topics such as sparkling wine, such as organics and biodynamics. Alternative varieties is one of them. So you can go in and download whatever you want and use it as you like. So for anyone who's going out and actually, you know, teaching about wine, all the slides I've used today come from this Australian Wine Discovered program. You can download the PowerPoints, literally grab out whichever slides you want and use them. They could be quite useful. But there's also a huge amount of information behind them as well, just for your own personal learning. So just something to flag up for you all. And I think that's me done.
It's great. Thank you so much.
If there's any questions?
Yeah, there are a few actually. And so should we stop share first?
Yes, I shall do.
All right. So there's one question sent to me directly. So I'll just start with that. And so probably someone who is preparing for the MW. So it says, as an MW, how would you spot Australian Chardonnay, so for example from McLaren Val, compared to other New World Chardonnays?
Really good question. And I think Chardonnay has come a huge way in Australia in the past 10 years. You know, it's one of the wines that really put Australia on the map, sort of back in the 90s, because it was so different from what a lot of people had at the time. It was much richer, much oakier and so on. But that's all changed, obviously, and, you know, people are picking earlier now, a lot less new oak, probably more larger format oak, and playing around with wild ferments and more solids and so on, as you're getting much funkier styles than they used to. So what that means is the wines, yeah, brilliant, absolutely incredible now, but they can be really hard to pick in a lineup because they are, you know, a lot of them aren't dissimilar to Burgundy or, you know, top Chardonnay from elsewhere in the world. I think what's always worth remembering though about Australia is what I flagged at the beginning is that with the latitude, so it is relatively close to the equator, so there is always this brilliant sunlight, this sunlight intensity. And I think even when you have got this influence of the climate, moderating the climate, so, you know, you're keeping your freshness in your grapes naturally, but you still have this brilliant sunlight. So what that tends to mean is you get that ripeness and that richness despite anything else. And that's something that's perhaps something worth looking at, but it's a tough one. It's really tough.
Okay, and yeah, so there is one question here from quite a few questions. The first question from Bill: does Australia have a classification system like French AOC IGP system?
You mean within regions? I guess. No, is the easy answer here. So you do have those 65 wine regions. They're all defined by law, defined legally. That's actually another part of what Wine Australia does. We have that legal and label integrity side. But no, beyond that, like most New World countries, winemakers are able to do whatever they like in terms of whatever they want to plant and so on. And there's no real classification system within that. And of course, different wineries will kind of use their own and, you know, flag if it's a single vineyard or whatever to show their different classifications or their own ladders. But there isn't anything legally, no.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question from Hannah. So with recent poor vintages and low yields in Burgundy, do you see an opportunity for the like of Margaret River Chardonnay and Tasmanian Pinot Noir to get a bit more airtime and publicity as being a well-priced alternative?
Yeah, well, that'd be ideal, wouldn't it? I think certainly places like Margaret River have been getting a huge amount of publicity and, you know, great critic ratings and so on lately, because they've had just a slew of amazing vintages in Margaret River, and the Chardonnays there are just world class. Whether people will long term move away from Burgundy, you know, it's, as anyone who knows is selling Burgundy, people who like Burgundy. They don't want something else, they just want Burgundy. But equally, there's, you know, only a certain amount of people who can necessarily afford great Burgundy these days, and perhaps are looking for something different, and certainly it would be a great place to start.
Good. And there's a question from John. How are producers dealing with scarcity of water for irrigation?
Good question, and that's something I think producers globally are challenged with, and will be increasingly so over the next few decades. It's different regions are different. You know, some regions don't have a huge amount of challenge with water scarcity, or others obviously do. Places like McLaren Vale is actually somewhere that is probably the global leader in terms of water use and sustainability, because they are totally sustainable in terms of their water use. So it's partly from an underground aquifer, which they're only allowed to access if the aquifer is over a certain amount, partly from water runoff. So a lot of the vineyards have their own dams, you know, that they collect rainwater in. But more recently, what they've actually done is, because McLaren Vale is just south of Adelaide, it's about a 30-40 minute drive, they've actually used wastewater runoff from the streets of Adelaide, recycled that, and then piped it down to McLaren Vale to use in their irrigation system. So, you know, there's that sort of novel way of thinking, I suppose, trying to figure out where they can access water. That being said, there are still a lot of vineyards in McLaren Vale, in Barossa and so on, which are dry farmed. You know, there are places that can do that, but certainly water access is going to be a problem for a lot of people globally.
Yeah, okay. And a question from Rebecca. So what were the impacts of last year's fire, the bushfires, in the wine industry?
A lot less than perhaps a lot of people think, I think, is the easy answer there. Actually, in terms of vineyard area that was directly affected, it's less than 1% of that 146,000 hectares. Very little vineyard area was anywhere near fires. So, you know, we heard quite a bit about the Adelaide Hills fire. So there was a little bit of vineyards that was, you know, actually burnt there, and also a bit up in Tumbarumba. Obviously, smoke taint is a slightly larger issue, and particularly regions Tumbarumba, Canberra and Hunter Valley. There's been already a lot of wineries there who said they're not producing any wine because of smoke taint. But basically the entirety of South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia, they didn't have any smoke taint at all there for those regions. So I think, you know, there's the regions which were badly affected by smoke taint, and those regions will be certainly way down in terms of production because of that. But other regions didn't see it at all.
Okay. And another question, could you say something about Australian Chenin Blanc in comparison to South African and French Chenin?
Oh, well, I suppose there's not a lot of Australian Chenin out there. I mean, there's a few great producers, but it's not one of the major varieties by a long way. So it's probably hard to give any kind of comparison, because you're probably more comparing producers rather than, you know, a regional style, because there's not any region that's particularly widely planted with Chenin.
Okay. And another question about grape variety, Hunter Valley Semillon. Could you please describe them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess what's always worth remembering about Hunter Valley, if you remember what I was talking at the beginning about the Great Dividing Range and how it acts as a rain shadow, and the wine regions are on the western side of that to escape the rain. Hunter is the actual exception to that. It's on the eastern side of the Great Dividing Range. So this is why it tends to get a lot of early vintage, late summer rains. So because of that, and because Semillon particularly ripens or is flavour ripe at relatively low sugars, it's picked quite early. So Hunter Semillon tends to be one of the first things that's picked in Australia. You're looking at the very beginning of January. So it tends to be picked when it's going to be low alcohol. I mean, Hunter Semillon is typically 10.5%, 11% alcohol, and very high acidity because of that, because they're obviously, those grapes are picked quite relatively unripe, with high acid levels to escape those rains. So Hunter Semillon, when it's young, can be very, very sharp and citrusy, and not a huge amount of complexity to it. But it's one of these incredible wines that, give it a bit of time in bottle, it just opens up and evolves and matures. And this is when it starts to get those toasty, nutty notes. And it really is an absolutely incredible wine, and something that's quite unique in the world of wine. You know, nowhere makes Semillon like Hunter Valley does. And it is because of this quite specific climate and the fact they have to pick these grapes quite early.
Okay, thank you. So Cyril is asking about the website for Australian Wine Discovered, which I will send to everyone.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So that's fine. Hannah's question, I think you've already answered. What has the fallout been from the bushfire being for the winery affected? So I think you've already touched upon. Yeah,
I think obviously any winery that's in a potentially smoke tainted affected region will be monitoring their ferments. The problem with smoke taint is that it's not something you can taste or see in the grapes themselves. You have to put the grapes through a ferment and then actually test the fermented wine to see if you've got any of the smoke taint compounds. So it can be quite a long process like that, but there's a lot of wineries who'll be doing that. And also the wineries who have already said they're not going to make any wine commercially, they're probably doing a bit of this process anyway, just for trials and for their own knowledge, to see actually at what level the smoke taint comes out.
Okay, so I think that's our last question. So, there's another one just popping up, so that will be the last one. So any Australian wines you'd particularly like to recommend at this minute?
Oh gosh, good question. Well, I suppose not particular wine, but style that I am just so excited about at the minute is Grenache, because I think particularly from McLaren Vale and Barossa, there's just some so exciting wines coming out, and predominantly these are from old vineyards, 80-plus-year-old vineyards. Most of them are bush vines, and it's a great variety that for a long time was kind of unloved and misunderstood, I think, in Australia, and they tended to make these wines more like a Shiraz, so picked quite lake and quite extracted and quite a lot of oak, and to that extent that they didn't taste like Grenache at all, they just tasted like a dry red. But I think more recently, you know, I'm talking the last 5 years, this is quite a recent phenomenon. The winemakers have realised they need to treat it more like a Pinot Noir, so pick a bit earlier, probably use a bit of whole bunch, either use no oak or only very old oak, and suddenly you're getting these really beautiful, ethereal, fragrant Grenaches that, you know, crisp and vibrant and crunchy, and just kind of all the stuff you want from a lovely red wine, particularly in the summer. So yeah, that's something I'm drinking a lot of.
That's great. Ooh. Other than Barossa Wine School, are there other certification for Australian wine?
Not that I know of. So our program, Australian Wine Discovered, we specifically decided not to have any certificate associated with it, because we just wanted to make it totally open access. So you can go in there and learn whatever you want, and it's free. You don't have to go in and pay for it. So it is quite different to a certification, but all that information is there and available to you.
Okay, so I think that's everything actually. And so thank you so much, Emma, for this very insightful session, and thank you all to all the participants. So I hope you find it very useful, and all the recording and the more links to our follow-up sessions will be sent to everyone. Okay, so thank you and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.